You're listening to the Cycling Podcast, brought to you by iWalker. Flexible loans built for small businesses. iwoca.co.uk.
Bonjour mes amis, it's Richard Moore here.
Well, it's fluent already.
I'm really integrating in France here, as you can hear. And I'm with Daniel Friebe. Hello Daniel.
Hello.
Do you feel like a new man this week?
Not really, no.
Passed a significant milestone at the weekend. How many weeks in a row can we mention your birthday is?
Time's marching on towards your half century.
Well, you can let me know what that's like. And Lionel Birnie. Hello Lionel.
Hello Richard. Hello Daniel. Happy birthday, belated happy birthday Daniel.
Thank you.
Arsenal won the FA Cup for you on your birthday. That was nice of them.
Yep. Yep.
And one of your tips won Strade Bianche. That was you mentioned Wout Van Aert last week.
Did I?
You also mentioned Max Schachmann, who was third. My tips: Søren Kragh Andersen and Michael Valgren. Inspired choices. They both rode extremely well. Kragh Andersen was quite an early retiree, and Valgren was 30th, 19 minutes 27 seconds down. So best not to follow my tips for all the races that might or might not come in the next few weeks. But we're talking on a Monday afternoon. There's a race on as we speak. What race is it, Daniel?
Trittico Lombardo, I think, which is a sort of 3-in-1. This is a replacement for the Coppa Agostoni, Tre Valli Varesine, and the Coppa Bernocchi. Which do they all still happen every year now? Well, they used to take place all in August, and they used to be classic. They used to be referred to as classics in Italy, but they were World Championship warm-up races back when the Worlds were in August, in fact. But then they remained in August even when the Worlds moved to the end of the season. And in the last few years, they have been at the back end, haven't they, in the weeks or the fortnight before Lombardy. And they've all been squished together for the reasons we all know.
It seemed like a sensible solution, though, to that problem, and I think one that other races might have done well to copy. I mean, Tour of Flanders and Paris-Roubaix, basically Tour of Flanders, the little circuit Tour of Flanders, and finishing on the cobbles and in the Roubaix Velodrome. I think that would have worked pretty well. Liège-Bastogne-Liège and Flèche-Wallonne. Liège-Bastogne-Liège with the Mur de Huy at the end. What other races could you join together?
The Giro, the Tour and the Vuelta.
Yes, that's
just
a good idea.
9 weeks. Just get through 9 weeks. Start in Milan, finish in Madrid. Done.
Boom. Milan San Remo and the Tour of Lombardy. Tag one on the other. Actually, they'd have worked as a Saturday Sunday, a good weekend out, wouldn't they? Those two. But we do have a period. We're sort of in the middle of we've got Strade Bianche at the weekend today. Milano Torino later in the week. Milan San Remo at the weekend. Although still some questions about Milan San Remo and the route that it will take. I think maybe you'll cover that in your news roundup, Lionel. What do you have for us?
Well, I was just going to let Daniel know that all 3 races were held last year. The defending champions, Tre Valli Varesine, was won by Primoz Roglic. The Coppa Agostoni was won by Alexander Ryobushenko of UAE Team Emirates, and the Coppa Bernocchi was won by Phil Bauhaus of Bahrain Merida. 3 years in a row Bahrain have won that race because Sonny Colbrelli won in 2018 and 2017. So, yeah, putting all these 3 races together, who will win? We might still be recording. We'll do a little update at the end. We'll do a second news roundup to bring listeners the winner of the Grande Trittico Lombardo. Racing resumed last week, didn't it? But the first World Tour race was on Saturday. Strade Bianche, won by Wout Van Aert on rim brakes, not on disc brakes. I mean, that's the big news for people. I know this is the sort of thing that excites you, Daniel, the sort of technological...
No, not
absolutely scoffing at that.
No, I'm not. Well, I think it was delivered in a fairly sarcastic tone, wasn't it? I mean, we're not noted for our technical expertise when it comes to bikes. I was actually thinking the other day. I was reading reviews. It seems to be quite in vogue at the moment to talk about. To produce aluminium frames again. Aluminium frames they've not been used at the top level for a very long time. Can you chaps remember? Can you name the last man not to win the Tour de France on a carbon frame?
Indurain?
No, I think it was Oscar Pereiro who rode on some kind of magnesium sort of hybrid type frame in 2006. But prior to that, I think it would have been Pantani. That was the last aluminium, I would say, in 1998. Anyways.
Well, anyway, Wout Van Aert was in incredibly good form, winning Strade Bianche on a very hot, dusty day in Tuscany. Only 42 finishes inside the time limit. And for Van Aert, well, it was only his second race since last year's Tour de France when he crashed out after hitting the barriers during the time trial in Pau. We'll hear a little bit from Van Aert. Richard, you spoke to him at his only other race so far this season, Omloop Het Nieuwsblad, back in early March, just before racing
late February,
was
I believe, wasn't it? It was the last day in February, perhaps.
Right. Well, Van Aert winning the race. It feels like a long 2 years since his breakthrough road result in the same race where he was with Tiesj, Benoot, the eventual winner, and Romain Bardet, and kind of locked up a bit, didn't he, on the run into Siena. I mean, this time round he was, well, the strongest man over the last 25 or so kilometres. Very impressive performance. We'll talk about that in the first part of the podcast. Sylvain Dillier of AG2R didn't get to start the race because he tested positive for COVID-19 in the final series of tests to check that all the riders were clear of the virus. And, well, we probably say every week, but the COVID-19 is going to have an impact like this on a lot of races, we suspect. But Dillier was unable to start the race. His AG2R teammates were okay because they were all negative for the virus. The women's race, which took place just before the men's race, was won by the world champion Annemiek van Vleuten, her second consecutive victory in Strade Bianche. Another very impressive performance, a thrilling pursuit of Margarita Garcia, or Mavi Garcia as she is known, a former duathlete who only switched to cycling in 2015, aged 31. Leah Thomas was third for Equipe Paul K. Richard, I think we're going to hear from Leah Thomas in the next episode of the cycling podcast Feminin, which will be out a bit later on this week.
That's correct.
A bad crash for Ashley Moolman-Pasio in training a couple of days before the race ruled her out. Very unfortunate to, obviously be out of action for so long because of the coronavirus and then crash just before the first event. The Vuelta a Burgos reached a conclusion. Remco Evenepoel, the new Eddie Merckx, surely, as I've been saying for weeks now, months.
I think that's Annemiek van Vleuten, actually. 100% record this year. She's the new Eddie Merckx.
Good point, yeah. Of course, she won the 2 races in Spain last week, didn't she? But yeah, the Vuelta a Burgos came to a conclusion. Sam Bennett won stage 4, and then Ivan Sosa of Team Ineos, who won overall in 2018 and 2019, won stage 5 to Lagunas de Nela, ahead of Mikel Landa and Remco Evenepoel, who defended his purpley jersey ahead of Mikel Landa. A very impressive performance. I mean, it's only the Vuelta a Burgos, but that climb again is another little step or two up, isn't it, Daniel?
Yes, Napalm, very steep. I mean, he sort of obliterated a lot of the doubts that people might have had about steep climbs, I think. He won uphill in that Algarve earlier this year, but that was on a fairly, almost a big ring climb. Nela is one of the steepest climbs that the international peloton does in the season. So I suppose people will still, wonder how he's going to cope with the longer climbs and the sort of consecutive mountain stages at the Giro. But he's definitely thrown his hat in the ring of contenders at the Giro. And, you just listen to what the other riders were saying. Mikel Landa was talking about how, the rest of the peloton really needs to take advantage of this sort of adolescent, in sort of cycling term, phase that Evenepoel is going to go through over the next couple of years. His road career is still very much in its infancy, and Landa suggesting that there's not going to be much to go around after that and when he has fully matured.
Do you mean attack him when Evenepoel's stomping up the stairs and slamming his bedroom door in a tizzy?
He's another one with 100% record though this year, isn't he? He's won every stage race that he's started.
That's right. La Route d'Occitanie in the south of France, formerly known as the Route du Sud. It's the big mountain stage today. In our second edition of News Roundup, we may be able to update on the stage winner there. But so far, the stages have been won by Brian Coquart and Sonny Colbrelli. Thibaut Pinot went down in a crash in the run-in on stage 1, but picked himself up and is apparently fine. Egan Bernal and Chris Froome are racing together for Team Ineos there, so it'll be interesting to see what the result is on the only mountain stage which is taking place as we record. Bahrain also had a victory at the Circuito de Getxo in Spain, thanks to Damiano Caruso. And Daniel, a couple of weeks ago you mentioned, when we were talking about the Everesting phenomenon, that everyone's a gangster until the real gangster walks in. Alberto Contador lowered the Everesting record. Well, that's been smashed out of sight by a 33-year-old Irishman called Ronan McLaughlin. The ride has been ratified by Hell's 500 and the record now stands at 7 hours, 4 minutes and 41 seconds. He rode on Mamor Gap in County Donegal. A 14% gradient. He chose a short, very steep section, and he raised nearly £9,000 for the community rescue services in Northern Ireland. He's a seasoned rider, rode the Worlds for Ireland in 2012, and he also rode for Sean Kelly's Ampost team as well for a while. But 7 hours and 4 minutes, that's a good 20 minutes off Contador's record. And I thought Contador was putting the record on the shelf for a little while, but clearly not.
Very famous climb, that Mamor Gap up in Donegal. It's like a mini Alpe d'Huez, really. It's got these kind of... there's this incredible vantage point from the top where you can look down and see the road at several different sections. There's a great picture Phil O'Connor took from the RAS in 1997 that showed different groups at different points of the road. It's a spectacular climb. If you ever do another book of the best climbs in Europe, Daniel, I would suggest it should feature.
Actually brought to mind the record when it was broken at the weekend, and this whole phenomenon was making me think at the weekend of this this trend and how it sort of mimics shadows what was happening in kind of mountaineering in like the 19th century. I was thinking about a quote from John Ruskin, was one of the famous art critic, writer, painter himself, poet, about climbing the mountains, and there's a famous quote. He sort of decried this trend in this rush to conquer various summits in the 19th century, and he said that climbers were looking upon the Alps themselves, which your own poets used to love so reverently, as soap poles in a bear garden, which you set yourselves to climb and slide down again with shrieks of delight. I can imagine Alberto Contador sort of sliding up and down a greased pole with shrieks of delight, in his next attempt on the Everesting record. But it does suggest that if 20 minutes have gone off it this time, then it suggests that the record has got a fair way to... well, it could come down a fair bit if people continue to go after it.
And the climbs are getting steeper and steeper. The preferred sort of gradient seems to be teetering towards almost... I mean, what's the steepest? They'll be looking for 20% gradient. Some of these climbs in Austria or somewhere, could they be feasible places to do it?
Yeah, and the straightness of the road is also a factor. The ideal road seems to be a very steep one with a very fast, obviously, well, the steeper it is, the faster it's going to be to come down, but a straight descent, because you can also gain a fair bit of time on the descents.
Well, I promised we'd update on the two races that took place today, and Richard and I have reconvened, but I can update on the Gran Tritico Lombardo, which finished in Varese. Television pictures were compromised by terrible rain in Varese today. Complete contrast to the hot weather at Strade Bianche at the weekend. There was an Astana 1-2 though. Gorka Izagirre won ahead of Alex Aramburu, with Greg Van Avermaet third and Michał Kwiatkowski fourth and Vincenzo Nibali in fifth. So does that give us any clues for Milan-San Remo at the weekend? Meanwhile, in the southwest of France, stage 3 of the Route d'Occitanie was a Team Ineos 1-2. Does this clear up anything with the Tour de France looming, or does this muddy the waters even more? Egan Bernal won the stage 10 seconds ahead of his teammate Pavel Sivakov. Thibaut Pinot was 4th, Bauke Mollema 5th, Warren Barguil 6th. You have to scroll quite a long way down the results though to see Chris Froome in 32nd place, 5 minutes and 5 seconds behind. Well, there's not a lot of time for Froome to close the gap back up to Bernal, is there?
Interesting, isn't it? That's, quite significant. I was told that it was an Ineos 1-2 before I was told the identity of the riders, and we've heard that Sivakov is absolutely flying, and we've mentioned the last couple of weeks that he could be the dark horse at the Tour and be the sort of understudy to Bernal there, perhaps. And he finished second today, but it's really Froome's performance that will be causing concern for Chris Froome, if nobody else, because that's quite a bit off the pace. Thibaut Pinot, a good performance it seems, but yeah, Froome, there's not a lot of time between now and the Tour de France to find those 5 minutes, unless we don't know yet whether something went wrong for him, but we'll find out.
Well, we know something went wrong for him. He finished 5 minutes behind, but we don't know whether there were extenuating circumstances.
That's correct.
That will all come out in the wash. But yeah, interesting. There was another Team Ineos related bit of news because Dylan van Baarle was quoted in the Dutch press speaking to the Dutch media about the coronavirus protocols in place at the race, and I gather not terribly pleased with some of the circumstances that the riders were placed in, particularly crowds at the start, finish and on the climbs not wearing masks.
And crowds, quite large crowds gathering. It's interesting because the scenes at the finishes in Occitanie very different to in Italy, and gatherings of up to 5,000 people are allowed in France, but I think there's frustration that a lot of the responsibility for health and safety, if we can call it that, is down to race organisers, and some are being very diligent and some, it seems, are not being so diligent, and so there's an inconsistency there, as there is, I think, in wider society, and that's unfortunate. But yeah, Ineos apparently not very happy with some of the protocols in place down in Occitanie.
Well, Van Baarle made the point that, all of the work that's going into making sure that the riders don't accidentally swap bidons or, share towels or, put themselves at risk that way, and then get to the finish and fans are close enough to ask him for a bottle as a souvenir. It's the inconsistency that's the issue here, really, isn't it?
It is, yes, that's the problem. I imagine that in bigger races it will be less of a problem, but given the shortness of the time that people have to get ready for big races, they're doing races that they might not otherwise have done, and maybe these races aren't, they'll be reliant on volunteers and people as well as paid staff, and they're maybe not set up. They maybe don't have the resources to provide the sort of infrastructure that you need to ensure that everybody's safe at starts and finishes and so on. So it's a very difficult time and a difficult situation, and I think we're going to see more stories like this over the next few weeks.
You're listening to the Cycling Podcast, brought to you by iWalker. Flexible loans built for small businesses. Join 50,000 customers taking on life's twists and turns and scaling new heights with iWalker. If you run a business, find out more at iwalker.co.uk, iwoca.co.uk.
My name's Rory Black, and my role in Kendal Cycle Club is Communications Secretary. Kendal Cycle Club is kindly supported by iWalker. It's a relatively young club, started October 2015, been completely blown away by the amount of people that have joined the club, just all the different ways the club has developed. We're up to 790 members. It's the fact that it's an inclusive club that's why so many people have joined the club. The aim of the club is to promote and develop all aspects of cycling, be inclusive to all, and to do this in a friendly and enjoyable environment. So that's our ethos, that's the club's ethos. All sorts of cyclists, people are into all sorts of different types of cycling, from track to mountain to road. The junior section is a really thriving area, so it's a fast-growing, relatively young club. It's been great to watch it evolve over the years.
Thank you once again to our title sponsor, iWalker. We heard there from Rory Black of the Kendal Cycle Club. iWalker sponsor the Kendal Cycle Club as well as the Cycling Podcast. They're big supporters of cycling, encourage a lot of their employees to cycle to work when they go and work in an office, that is, of course. Just a reminder, if you run a small business, iWalker are accredited by the British Business Bank to offer CBILS, that's the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme. They're also offering their normal loans as well. So if you are looking for investment in your business or to develop your business, grow your business, go to iwaka.co.uk and see what they have to offer. Chaps, I'm sure we were all glued to our screens on Saturday for the first World Tour race of the resumed season, and I think expectations are always very high for Strade Bianche. It's not an old race, but it's a race that has captured people's imagination. It's a beautiful race. It's unusual. It uses these white roads in Tuscany, which in early March can be dusty and white, or dirty and grey depending on the weather. And we've seen them used in the Giro as well, where we there's been rain and they've been a completely different type of proposition. And on Saturday it was different again. 40-degree heat, incredibly dry and dusty. You could see, I think, among the riders that the preoccupation was to keep hydrated and keep cool, and that was quite a challenge with team cars spread all over the place. But a really strong group formed at the front, and I think when Jakob Fuglsang went off the front with about 40 kilometres to go, was it a bit more than that, in fact? I think about 50 odd kilometres to go.
Because he was caught by the others with 43 to go, so...
Yeah, he was away for 7 or 8 kilometres perhaps on his own. And I thought, as I'm sure you did, that he might just ride away, because he has been somebody who certainly last year looked like a different rider and did something similar at Liège-Bastogne-Liège, but he was caught, and it was a very open race. There were quite a few there were a lot of attacks. Schachmann, Alberto Bettiel, Wout Van Aert, Jakob Fuglsang, all of them looked like they could win, and Davide Formolo as well. And it was an open race and a really exciting race to watch, I thought.
I think we always talk about how unpredictable this race is, just because it doesn't really, it's not easily pigeonholed. It's not necessarily the best classics riders who come to the fore. You often get some riders who are ordinarily good climbers as well. And then before this race last week, there was a lot of talk about the difference in the consistency of the white roads, the kind of texture of the white roads at this time of year. People who rode the course, sort of test rode the course on Thursday and Friday, talked about this thick layer of dust that accumulates on top in the summer, and it makes the wheels sort of sink in, and consequently it was going to be hard to attack out of the saddle. That's what people were saying. That wasn't necessarily the case based on what I saw. Wout Van Aert's winning attack, for example, well, he was certainly out of the saddle there, but it's always difficult to tell, isn't it, as a watching spectator, how big a part the off-road element plays. I mean, if you look back at the palmarès of the race, it would suggest that good bike handling is important, but it's difficult to gauge just to what extent it is important. Even Van Aert himself and Mathieu van der Poel before the race said that they thought it would be a factor, and yeah, as I say, Van Aert winning suggests it was.
Yeah, that's right, Daniel. But the Fuglsang attack came on the one of the longest sections, I think the longest section of dirt road, 11.5 kilometres. The caption came up in French on TV, Monte Sainte Marie. But what's that in Italian?
Santa Maria.
Santa Maria, yeah. So Fuglsang attacked on that section. There was a couple of changes of lead on that longer section. And then Van Aert went on Sector 11, which is only 600 or so metres long. So the two big moves in the race happened on the dirt road, and the dirt roads did enough to cause all sorts of punctures, mechanical problems as well. Earlier on in the race, several riders went down. Julian Alaphilippe of Deceuninck Quickstep had a shocker, as many as 6 punctures according to Alaphilippe, 3 bike changes, and a problem with his wheel very early on before they even got to the dirt roads. But I think that was a significant factor, that Deceuninck Quickstep were out of the picture from quite a long way out. They had Stibar in a chase group, working very hard to try and get across to the leaders, but even had he managed to get into the thick of things in time, probably would have been cooked from that effort. But I think that was the thing that was most interesting to me, was that Deceuninck Quickstep were really nowhere to be seen when it really mattered.
Yeah, I mean, there were 6 riders in that breakaway. Greg Van Avermaet was the other one, though he was tailed off. didn't seem to be on a great day. But 6 riders, all from different teams, and all fancied riders without being sort of overwhelming favourites, and all quite different riders too. I mean, your tipping of Schachmann was inspired, Daniel, because he's not a rider necessarily with a track record in that race or in the classics generally, but clearly at Paris-Nice he was in great form. And I suppose my thinking behind Søren Kragh Andersen was, I thought Sunweb were as a unit really good at Paris-Nice, and I imagined that what we would see on Saturday was a kind of a continuation of what we saw in the early part of the season, where those guys would have gone into the lockdown period feeling good about themselves and motivated and, committed and all the rest of it. And I imagined that the pattern that we might see, certainly in the early weeks of this resumption, might be similar to what we'd seen in the early part. That's why I think we're expecting Quintana to be good again as well. But that didn't quite happen for Sunweb, but it certainly did for Schachmann, who did, and he's just signed a contract extension, but he does look like the real deal, doesn't he? And Davide Formolo, another one who, they were teammates last year at Bora Hansgrohe. He's at UAE Team Emirates now, Formolo, and it was a really strong performance from him. But all those guys in that front group had a go, and they all looked like they could be potential winners. And it is perhaps, because none of them had, they were all from different teams, that meant the race was very open and aggressive.
Schachmann didn't have a great record, Rich, in this particular race. I think he finished 27th or 29th last year. But quite simply, now I think he's one of the best riders in the world, and he's proving that, will prove that over the coming months. I mean, if you go back and look at his spring last year, it maybe went a little bit under the radar just how good he was last spring. He won Larciano, he won a stage at Catalunya, he won 3 stages at the Tour of the Basque Country, and we all know how hard a race that is. So, my only question with him is where he's going to be at his best. I think he can be competitive on lots of different terrains in lots of different types of races, but he does have this sort of long-term plan to target Grand Tours. I don't know how soon he's going to do that, but he's going to be one of the big names, the major names in the sport over the next few years. Formolo is an interesting one as well, because he's been strong for a number of years, but there's a bit of a difference of opinion about where he should focus his efforts. His best results in the last couple of years have come in one-day races, but he still considers himself to be a stage racer, and he still has ambitions in those going forward. But yeah, it was a really good ride from him. The other thing that really struck me, chaps, just watching Strade Bianche on Saturday was how fantastic it looked in August, and just the aesthetics of what is already, even in February, one of the most beautiful races on the calendar, one of the most intriguing, compelling races on the calendar. But to me, in August, with the sun sort of high in the sky and the kind of ochre light which brings out the sort of best in Siena and the Tuscan landscape as well. And I know over the next few months we're going to see a lot of races in unaccustomed positions in the calendar, and we're probably going to have this kind of conversation again. This was the first World Tour race, and it already got me thinking that maybe August or a different time of the year would be a better home for it. The problem is always in cycling, how do you fit it into the overall narrative? You can't just plonk it on the 1st of August, or maybe you can, maybe as a post-Tour de France race, but then, you want it to be part of a block that a certain type of rider is targeting for it to come before or after something similar.
It started off in October, didn't it, originally? And it's hard to measure, I think, in a way, because the great benefit that it has usually, and also this time, is that it's the first race, the first big race in a way. So, when it comes in early March, okay, it comes just after Het Nieuwsblad, but it's tends to be the first race we maybe see in that kind of sunshine, because it often is that spring sunshine in Tuscany at that time of year. And this time it had the great advantage of being the first World Tour race post-lockdown. So it has this atmosphere around it, this anticipation building up to it that owes partly to it, to being the first. And I think, if it was in August between the Tour and the Vuelta, a bit like San Sebastian, it suffers a bit from that, I think.
I think the other thing is that in the spring there's a sense of unpredictability about it, isn't there? It could be a bright, fine day. It could be an absolute stinker of a day. So you could, as Richard said, you could have a dusty, bright edition, or you could have a really gritty, grey edition. Whereas if it's in August, the chances are that the weather is going to be pretty good in Tuscany in the summer, in the height of the summer. So I think it's probably best as a spring race or an autumn race where you get that, will it rain, won't it rain type factor. What was interesting to me was if you look at that top 10, if that top 10 had been the result of the race back in March, you wouldn't really have batted an eyelid, I don't think. Perhaps Formolo and Schachmann would have focused more on the Ardennes classics rather than being at their best in early March, but then Schachmann was very good in Paris-Nice, wasn't he? And Richard, you made the point about Formolo and Schachmann being Bora-Hansgrohe teammates last year. They, of course, were second and third behind Jakob Fuglsang in a really tough edition of Liège-Bastogne-Liège last year. I did sort of, as Formolo and Schachmann were they were chasing Van Aert, but not terribly effectively on the run in to Siena. And there was a moment where Formolo kind of took his hands off the bars and lifted his glasses to give a bit of a cartoonish look to Schachmann, because there wasn't a great deal of sense that perhaps Schachmann was putting as much into the chase as Formolo, certainly from watching on the TV. But probably Van Aert by that stage had flown and was really powering over those final kilometres. Convincing victory. No, really, from the moment he attacked, there was a sort of a half effort to try and get on terms. But once Van Aert had the bit of daylight, that was it. Really, I don't think, was there any sense when you were watching thinking that they would bring him back? I certainly didn't think so.
There was briefly, I think, initially there was a sort of almost a calculation too, because it did look like Van Aert was the strongest, and that if the thing that makes it interesting is that final climb up into Siena, because it's a hard climb, and had they caught him just at the bottom of that, it might have been quite difficult for him. And if he, when the gap was 9 or 10 seconds, had he sort of sat up and waited for them, he may well have got them anyway on the climb, because he did look the strongest whenever they were going uphill, Van Aert, but there would have been obviously an element of risk in doing that. So there was a moment in the race, I think, where it looked in the balance a little bit, but he definitely was the deserving winner, Van Aert, no question.
I'm more preoccupied and slightly miffed at the short shrift you gave my very valid point about the tonality of the light, and and
no, I thought the tonality of the light was wonderful.
Well, you didn't even barely got a mention in Napalm's spiel about how the race should stay where it is in the spring. It looked the classic images of Tuscany are of that, sun high in the sky, the beautiful sort of ochre terracotta and burnt light, and I thought we saw that, and it was that was certainly the aspects of the race that I most enjoyed on Saturday.
Well, we've got our audio clip for social media this week anyway. Thanks, Daniel.
It was magnificent. But what I'm saying, as a one-off, it was fantastic. But I like the fact that you just never quite know with the spring and autumn races. It might be a lovely day, it might not. If you had Strade Bianche every year and it was just blazing hot, I don't know. Maybe. Does that matter?
Well, the other question, I suppose, is safety as well. There were a lot of comments from the riders about how difficult it was to see the visibility. I don't know if it was worse than on a dry day in March. I got the impression that was the case, and it was also very hot, and I think hydration was a big factor that a lot of the riders were talking about before the race and after the race as well. I think Van Aert was probably one of the guys who got his sort of feeding strategy just right. Also on aesthetics, chaps, Van Aert, it's natural to set him off against Van der Poel because of their great rivalry in cyclocross, and I sort of do it automatically, but to me Van Aert is the more exciting rider, just because I prefer how he looks on a bike. I think he looks fantastic on a bike, really stylish, whether it's attacking uphill or sort of time trialing away from Formolo and Schachmann at the end of the race on Saturday. And I think it was sort of overlooked what a sensation he was in June and July last year at the Dauphiné. I was at the Dauphiné last year, and just to see the way he absolutely trounced the opposition in the time trial there, and then won a sprint stage as well, beat Sam Bennett, and then the Tour de France he really did a bit of everything. He was setting up Groenewegen, he won a sprint stage himself, and then of course it was curtailed by the crash he had in the time trial.
And was he not going to win the time trial? Am I right in recalling?
He was on a good ride, but I don't think he was going to win.
Right, maybe not. I mean, Alaphilippe obviously was coming later. He was on a good ride, that's for sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a controversial thing to say, Daniel, that
Do you agree that
he's a more
stylish?
exciting rider. I think he's more stylish, but I think in a way Van der Poel's a more exciting rider for the way that he rides. I mean, Van Aert is a more sort of classic kind of road racer, whereas Van der Poel races off a different script, and that's, I think, what makes him exciting. We didn't mention him last week in our run through the favourites, and we should have done, and I think he was riding well, but obviously had quite a lot of bad luck. I think they're different, and yeah, Van Aert, as he settles into his road career, is resembling more and more a classic road racer in a way. Apart from obviously excelling at Strade Bianche, it's obviously a race he loves, and that does have the off-road elements to it, but apart from that, you wouldn't really know that he'd come from cyclocross, I don't think, from the way that he rides.
Van Aert on the bike is a De Vlamingh, and Van der Poel is a Merckx. Van der Poel is a stomper. He looks like he's trying to get a lemur or a koala off his ankles, or he's clinging up to his ankle.
Van der Poel just always wants to ride from the front and attack, whereas Van Aert has got more tricks up his sleeve, perhaps, and yeah, as you say, he won a sprint, he wins time trials,
and he's a good teammate, I think, as well. I mean, I'm not saying that Van der Poel isn't, but he hasn't been in a position where he's had to do team jobs, where Van Aert has done fantastic work for his teammates.
Well, they're in very different teams. I mean, speaking about Van der Poel at the start of the year, it was described that team, Alpecin Fenix, was described as basically Molteni. Where Merckx was all powerful, and at that team it's all about Van der Poel, whereas Van Aert is in a team that's very much the sum of its parts, isn't it? It's got many strings to its bow, that Jumbo-Visma team. But speaking of Van Aert, you mentioned earlier, Lionel, I did speak to him at the start of the year. I mean, it's easy, especially with this result here, to overlook just how serious his crash was at the Tour de France last year. It was a really bad one. It threw his career into question, really. Well, I spoke to him in Gent at the opening weekend, the day before Het Nieuwsblad. He had flown back to ride Het Nieuwsblad as a last-minute decision from Tenerife because of coronavirus and the threat that it was posing to the upcoming races that had been on his schedule. So he flew back to ride Het Nieuwsblad, and I spoke to him the day before that about that race. So we'll not hear that, but we'll hear what he had to say about his crash at the Tour de France and rehabilitation. Did you worry that you might not get back to your previous level, because it was a horrific injury that you suffered?
Yeah, I did. I think in the beginning was a really hard period. Yeah, first I could barely walk. At least it took 7 to 8 weeks to walk without crutches. So of course these are periods that's not really funny, and that you think about not being able to walk anymore or not being able to be a professional cyclist anymore. But now I think this period is over, and I'm really positive for the future, and I hope to come to my old level again, and I'm working hard for it.
Do you feel like the same rider? And we saw you at Strade Bianche last year, and obviously the Tour as well, riding extremely well. Do you feel like you're the same rider?
That's a good question. I think my training values are good, and are there that we don't see too much difference anymore. But in races you have so much repetitions of hard efforts that it's always good to wait to feel it in the race. You
were told in December with some of your teammates that you'd be riding the Tour de France, a very early decision by the team. I guess that must have been good for you, given that you were still coming back from your injury. But what's it like to have that much notice that you'd be riding the Tour?
Of course, it was a really big motivation for me, especially in that period. I think it would also be really normal that the team would have waited to see how my rehab was going, my recovery. Apparently they had a lot of confidence in me, and for a rider it's always good to have good planning in your mind and to know what's up next. So keeps you sharp after the classics. That okay, this summer Tour de France is coming, and with the team we have this year, we go for the yellow jersey actually, and I'm really proud and happy to be part of that.
Chute à l'arrière du peloton, Cycling Podcast Team Car at the back of the pack, please.
That said, PK interrupting this week's episode to remind me to tell you that it is sponsored by Whoop. Now, Whoop is a fitness wearable that provides personalised insights on how recovered you are and how much stress you put your body through during the day, so you can maximise your workouts and performance. Every day when you get up, Whoop gives you a recovery score based on your sleep, resting heart rate and heart rate variability. And this score lets you know how to approach your day. Lionel, you and I had a call with Whoop last week to learn a bit more about how it works, and I'm really intrigued and really looking forward to trying it out. I haven't got mine yet, but you've got yours, and you're up and running.
I am, Rich, yeah.
Or not, or perhaps resting.
Well, that's a very interesting thing. First of all, I got the Whoop device out of the packaging, beautifully packaged and very simple to set up. It's well, Richard, you were telling me about your training programs from the late 80s and talking about your heart rate, that we've all worn the chest strap style heart rate monitors, haven't we? This is a very similar theory, but it just goes round the wrist like a watch. It's gathering data day and night, and it pairs up very simply with an app on my phone. When we spoke to the people from Whoop, they talked about checking out how well you've rested overnight and getting your score. Now, I've got a 2-year-old toddler who does compromise our sleep somewhat at night, and now I have a number that I can put on that. So I haven't been out on my bike
I'm not
today.
sure this is what it's designed for, but anyway.
But it was really interesting to see, and obviously I've only done one night so far because I only got the device a couple of days ago, but I'm going to be really intrigued to see if there is a pattern developing and whether that pattern tallies with how I actually feel. Now, the number this morning, I was going to go out and do a couple of hours on my bike this morning, but I decided that I would listen to the Whoop. I had not a great recoverability score overnight, so I thought I'll take a day off and I'll see whether I recover a bit better, have a better night's rest tonight, and then go out on the bike tomorrow instead. I'm not going to use it as an excuse not to do anything, but I am going to.
Sounds like that's exactly what you're going to do.
Well, like I say, it's the interesting thing will be the pattern. If I know that my recovery level is ordinarily that low, well, that's just tough, isn't it? I'll just have to. That's just the best me I can be, I guess. But I'm looking forward to finding out.
If you can only be 10%, Lionel, then be 100% of your 10%.
Absolutely.
It's a relief to know that you're not going to be overtraining thanks to your Whoop device. Whoop have also partnered with leading health organisations recently to study the link between respiratory rate and COVID-19. So Whoop is helping workers, universities and pro athletes stay healthy while returning to work and to their sports. Now, Whoop is offering 15% off right now with the code CYCLE at the checkout. Go to Whoop, that's WHOOP.com, and enter CYCLE at checkout to save 15%. Sleep better, recover faster, and train smarter. Optimize your performance with Whoop today.
I should just point out, Rich, that there's also a strain score which is calculated over the course of the day, and I did do quite a short but tough ride yesterday, so maybe that's had a bearing on my recovery as well. I'm not just idle, you know.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing next week what this pattern looks like, Lionel.
Well, before the break there, we heard from Wout Van Aert about his recovery from that crash, pretty spectacular crash during the time trial at the Tour de France last year. Rich, you were talking about Van Aert's style on a bike. What really impressed me was in the last 25 kilometres of the race, there were two absolutely key moments, and he was alert for both of them. Max Schachmann attacked. He dropped off the back of the group and let a couple of bike lengths open up. Van Aert was kind of drifting back there with him. Schachmann attacked and Van Aert was straight on him. And, that could have been a significant move. And perhaps if Schachmann had got away on his own, they wouldn't have all kind of come back together. And then, of course, when they got onto that last section of dirt road, Van Aert made his move, put everybody else right on the back foot. It was a combination of seizing the moment and having the strength to do so. It was, it really was an impressive victory, especially when, you think about how long he's had out of. I mean, I know everyone's been out of race action over the last few months, but Van Aert hasn't he's had to overcome the injuries from that crash. So it was impressive. But one other rider who caught the eye throughout the afternoon was Alberto Bettiol, the home favourite, really, wasn't he? He's from Tuscany. Poggi Bonzi, is that right? Just to the north of Siena, and I thought he rode really well. Again, was alert both when Schachmann attacked. He hesitated a little bit, but then did try to ride across, and he was really the one that instigated it all coming back together again. And then when Van Aert went, Bettiol was, he was trying to stay on terms with Formolo and Schachmann. He'd probably, spent all the pennies in his pocket by that stage. But it was an impressive ride, and I thought, he finished fourth, didn't he? Nearly on the podium, but a decent result for the home rider.
Yeah, I mean, the four best riders in the end, because Fuglsang and Van Avermaet faded, and they were the experienced riders in the break. Those four never really won a big one-day race before, so for each of them there was a lot at stake. Bettiol, Tour of Flanders.
The Tour of Flanders.
The top three of them. Okay, well, Bettiol, I would say, also had something to prove, didn't he? Because I think that Tour of Flanders win is seen maybe unfairly as a bit of a flash in the pan, and he's not really backed it up since, and I think he struggled since to back it up. So I think that result, that performance, will have done his confidence a lot of good. I was going to mention, if anybody's interested in hearing from Max Schachmann at length, he did feature in one of our Giro episodes, The End of the World as We Knew It. The episode was called, I think, and it was mainly about his win at Paris-Nice. Daniel had a long conversation with him, so if you want to hear more from Max Schachmann, go back and listen to that and forget what I said. But the three of them, okay, Van Aert, Formolo, Schachmann, none of them had really won a big one-day race before. It felt like quite a kind of fresh, there were none of the heads of state there, the Sagans, the Kwiatkowskis, Van Avermaet had been dropped, the Gilberts, those kind of guys.
Yeah,
none of them were there.
But has Van Aert now completed Strade Bianche? I mean, 3 races, third twice and now first. I mean, needs to go on to the next level now.
Paris-Roubaix next for him, no?
Why not?
So we've already talked about, or I've already mentioned my failed tips, but my other tip last week was going to be, and I'm glad I didn't mention it, but I was going to just pick any of the De Koning Quick-Step team to win Strade Bianche, because it's always such a safe bet. But it wasn't. Very unusual to see them not in the reckoning. We're not quite sure what happened to Zdenek Stybar, and he charged late, but too late. And across in Spain, however, it was a different story, with Remco Evenepoel winning in Burgos. And we spoke last week about his stage win, which was very impressive. And then the big mountain stage was on Saturday. And he didn't quite win that, and I thought he did attack at one point, went off the front, left Mikel Landa and Ivan Souza behind, but they got him back, and I thought it was good to see him crack a little bit, not much, but a little bit. And Souza obviously won the stage. Landa took a little bit of time back from Evenepoel, but Evenepoel, it was reassuring in a way not to see him dominate in the way that he might have done, but still a very convincing winner nonetheless.
Yes, Rich, and as we mentioned at the start of the show, I mean, Lagunas de Neila is one of the steepest climbs around. So it would be worrying if he was beating the likes of Ivan Souza, who'd already won on that climb twice, and Mikel Landa, also a previous winner on that climb, and by the same sort of margin that he had at Picon Blanco. But the other contenders for the Giro are going to be pretty concerned looking at that, I would have thought. And as you mentioned, it was a very good race generally for De Koning Quick-Step. Sam Bennett, of course, won a stage in slightly unconventional circumstances, because we expected a bunch sprint, but it was a fiddly little finish with a bit of a climb and a hairpin turn with a kilometre to go, and half the peloton came down, and Bennett was very smart in seizing his moment, and a real sort of finisseur's number to win on his own. But then couldn't help but notice and be impressed by João Almeida's performance as well, the young Portuguese rider who has been a highly touted amateur, ridden for Axel Merckx's team, the Hagens, Berman, Axion team. He's had a lot of good results, or he had a lot of good results as an amateur, but hasn't been hyped to the extent of, well, certainly not Evenepoel, but some of the riders who have turned pro in the last 12 months or so. But it looks as though he's going to be a real prospect, or is a real prospect, certainly as far as stage racing is concerned.
What do we make of Mikel Landa then? Looked pretty good, but kind of did a Landa again, didn't he? They're always there or thereabouts. I mean, he's what's the cliche? Always the bridesmaid, never the bride. Poor old Mikel Landa.
It's quite hard to put your finger on what exactly, if anything, he does do wrong, though.
It is. It's just he's never quite in the right place at the right time. The attack goes when he's on the wrong side of the road, or just behind on the wrong wheel, or what have you, or he makes his effort. It's easy to say with hindsight, because I didn't necessarily think he was getting it all wrong on Lagunas de Naila or on Saturday, but he didn't really do enough to unseat Evenepoel, and then the next thing, he's chasing again. It's just extraordinary, really.
He was in a difficult situation there, because you're riding with you've got half an eye on GC and half an eye on the stage win, haven't you? I mean, Sousa had one goal there, but that was to win the stage because he was out of it on GC. Evenepoel had a simple job to defend the jersey. Landa's thinking he'd like to win the stage, but also, if he sees any kind of weakness in Evenepoel, to capitalise on that. So he was in a difficult position there. But it's true that he often seems to be in that position, unfortunately. Poor old Mikel Landa. That'd be a T-shirt. That should be a T-shirt, shouldn't it? Poor old Mikel Landa.
Interesting that Landa went to Burgos without the sort of support crew or the domestiques that I expect will be helping him in the Tour de France. Wout Poels wasn't there, and we talked, didn't we, about other teams, and Ineos in particular, sort of building this group, this Tour kernel of riders that are going everywhere together before the Tour, or seem to be, and it's a new team for Landa. First time he will be going into the Tour de France as a leader, a real undisputed team leader, and you would have thought that Burgos would have been a good opportunity to start to get the kind of mechanisms in place, the teamwork in place that he'll be relying on in the Tour.
So, question for you chaps, when Evenepoel wins the Giro, what's the last Grand Tour win by that team? Quick Step, De Koning Quick Step.
They've never won one.
I think that might be right. I don't know the answer.
Oh, right.
That's sneaky.
One crumb of comfort for Landa, possibly, chaps, is how bad Movistar were in Burgos. Slightly alarming, really. I mean, Rich, you picked out last week, you mentioned that Valverde had gone pretty badly at Picon Blanco, and I suggested you were being a bit hasty, writing him off, saying that he was a fading force. But he didn't go well at Lagunas de Naila, and Marc Soler also did not go well at all. Soler's main goal is the Giro, so that's a fair way off still, but they might be slightly nervous about the way they're shaping up, certainly a month from Tour de France, or less than a month now.
Well, we did that episode at the start of the year, didn't we, looking at Movistar this year. A real transitional year, maybe a couple of years for them, really, because they've got such a young team of largely unproven talents. Enric Mas, there'll be a lot of pressure on him, I guess, when we get to the bigger races. It's interesting you say a lot of time to turn it around, because Strade Bianche, normally you're looking at that race and thinking, we're months away from the Tour de France. At this time we're weeks away. We're 3 weeks away from the Tour de France, and there's not a lot of time to turn it around. If you're not in form now, it's going to be difficult to turn it around in time for the big races that are coming up. But yeah, fascinating.
The Cycling Podcast is supported by Science in Sport. Science in Sport. Fueled by science.
Big thanks to Science in Sport for their continued support of the Cycling Podcast. You can still get 25% off all your Science in Sport products with the code SISCP25 at scienceinsport.com. Well, I spoke a couple of weeks ago to James Morton, Director of Performance Solutions at Science in Sport, and a reminder that he will take your questions too if you would like to email them in, either audio file or write them out. He's a world-renowned nutritionist, sports nutritionist, and he would be pleased to answer your questions. So send us them in, contact@thecyclingpodcast.com. One of the things I asked James about when I spoke to him recently was about weight loss, because that's obviously a huge thing in cycling, and can be dangerous, obviously, to do without the right supervision and so on. So I asked James a little bit about weight loss in cycling.
I would say one of the hottest topics probably across all sports at the minute is the concept of relative energy deficiency in sport. This is an extension of the female athlete triad. So elite female athletes, when they consume not enough energy, they have impairments to the menstrual cycle, they have low bone mineral density. So that was the female athlete triad. It's now being extended to the male athlete. Some scientists refer to this as the male athlete triad. Other scientists refer to it as relative energy deficiency in sport. But the basic premise is that if you consume too few calories for too long of a time consistently, then many physiological systems start to become damaged. And this has a lot of application for cyclists, actually, because, as you know, changing your body composition can sometimes be the difference between winning and losing. But many riders would push it to extremes, and they would go low calorie for weeks and months on end. And I think the big challenge that we now face is, how do you almost periodize that energy intake while still losing weight? So some days you have high energy days, some days you have low energy days. But over the week, you accumulate an energy deficit. And over weeks and months, then ultimately you arrive at your optimal body composition, but you haven't pushed it too hard. I think we'll see some real sophisticated models of how do we do that practically in the coming years.
So that was James Morton. Do send us your questions for James Morton concerning sports nutrition. Contact@thecyclingpodcast.com. So this weekend, we're looking forward to Milan-San Remo, I think. Are we, Daniel? What's the latest?
Yes, well, as far as we know, the race is going ahead. There's been a bit of wrangling with local mayors and local officials about the race being allowed through certain towns. The latest one was Alessandria in Piedmont, and the officials from that town were opposed to the race going through on Saturday, but I think the last remaining obstacles will be overcome, and it should go ahead on Saturday. It's going to be interesting, isn't it? Not least because of the weather, and that combined with the length of the race. Obviously, it's more or less the same length as usual, slightly longer, 299 kilometers. But Strade Bianche, we saw what carnage occurred there at the weekend. Over 188 kilometers, obviously a different course, but you add on 110 to that, and similar kind of weather, and a slightly hillier route than the usual San Remo route, and I think we might get quite a different race from the usual. That said, I've revived my top 18 most likely to win. There's a preponderance of sprinters. Still
wonderful.
So
I need to make a note of these.
Do you want it, chaps?
Hang on.
Yeah, run through
ascending order. Well, that means that the most likely last. So 18: Nibali, Alaphilippe, Trentin, Bettiol, Tadej Pogacar, Philippe Gilbert.
Oh, to go on the Poggio.
Yes. Christophe Colbrelli, Sagan, WVA, GVA, Buani, Nasser Buani, Viviani, Bennett, Sam Bennett, Bonifacio, Ewan, Matthews, Narston, and Gaviria.
Cavendish.
Cavendish is not riding Milan-San Remo. Gaviria is my favourite, based purely on the first sprint he did in Burgos. Based on the fact that when he rode San Remo for the first time a couple of years ago, he looked as though he was going to win about 7 of them, but has had a few problems since then.
Can't believe you didn't mention Soren Krauss Andersen.
Bennett, I would put higher than that, Sam Bennett, but
yeah,
I'm not going to quibble with the 18.
Yeah. I think Bennett's a good shout for quite an attritional race where it's maybe a smaller group, that gets to the finish. I think he's a more versatile rider than some of those other sprinters.
I think it might get a little bit complicated tactically. Well, we always say this about De Koninck in Milan-San Remo because they always go in with 4 or 5 potential winners, or at least 3 potential winners, and we always think they're going to tread on each other's toes and it's going to ruin everything, but that hasn't necessarily been the case, has it?
The big question is, what's the race called? It's normally La Primavera. Now it's being held in August. L'Estate? Does that work?
That would be the summer. Not much of a name, is it? We've always preferred La Classicissima anyway to La Primavera, and the Italians use La Classicissima more than La Primavera.
The problem with Milan-San Remo is the same no matter what time of year it's held, that there are so many different, as your top 18 illustrates, there are so many different types of riders who you could imagine winning in different scenarios. And it's difficult, for all that I mentioned it might be attritional, it's difficult to imagine that the heat would have the same effect on this race as it had at Strade Bianche, where one of the issues there was getting enough fluid in, the logistics of that, and especially with the extra distance, the race being quite controlled almost, and coming down to because
there are 6-man teams, don't you?
Yes, that's true. Yeah, but in this heat as well, that's going to be a deterrent. People going too early, so it might be quite controlled until quite late on in the race. But it might not be. Fausto Coppi might attack coming through the tunnel.
I mean, with 6-man teams, I think it'll be less controlled, with less sort of certainties about how everyone's going. I think it'll be less controlled. And also just we always talk about these sort of dogmas, these fixed points that correspond to, often in classics, geographical locations. So, everyone knows that La Redoute, this happens on La Redoute, or this doesn't happen on La Redoute. And it's the same with Milan-San Remo. Everyone, since when Chiappucci won, everyone has known that the decisive attack can't really go on the Turchino, so no one really serious bothers even trying. And even applies to the Cipressa now. Whereas if you change the course around, and all of a sudden the cards are sort of are mixed up slightly, and some of those dogmas might go out of the window. And with the different temperature, different conditions, different time of year, and we might see something quite
unusual. And the profile
unusual.
Is significantly different, isn't it? I mean, normally when they reach the coast, there's still a long way to go, and it's lovely, and it's like a billiard table, apart from the Capi and the Cipressa and the Poggio, and of course the Cipressa and Poggio, they have to kind of come inland a bit to go up those hills. I mean, this is a very different type of course. It looks all right. The profile graphic might be fairly rudimentary looking, but it does look to be just steady uphill for 2/3 of the course. That's quite a different type of race. It's not going to be just sitting in the wheels. I know, that's not easy, especially when it's fast, but it could be a very different type of race. And if a break goes, with 6-man teams, who's going to chase? All of those different factors. I mean, it really could be a Milan-San Remo that we haven't seen the like of since. Well, you mentioned Fausto Coppi, but yeah, since the 50s, somebody could really upset the apple cart. There's no blueprint for it either, is there? It's not a case of just thinking, well, this worked in the past, so let's do this, sit and wait for this particular point. There isn't a particular point.
And if it comes down to the sprint finish, chaps, as we always say and as we always see, it's probably the most interesting sprint finish of the year, because generally speaking, there are no lead-out men left. There's certainly no trains left at that point. The riders are tired. And, I put Bonifacio as my 5th rider. I just have this image of him in Paris-Nice on at the 5th stage. There was quite a fiddly little finish, and it was quite a slow sprint, or it started. It was almost a sort of dead start for the sprint, and he flew out of the front of the pack. And you can get scenarios like that where there isn't enough speed coming into the sprint, and someone quite unexpected can win.
I mean, more interesting racing this week as well. Tour de l'Ain in France, 3-day stage race. Again, one that normally don't pay too much attention to, but what's interesting here in particular, Team Ineos have got Froome and Bernal again, but Jumbo-Visma are bringing their Trident out to play for the first time. That basically looks like their Tour de France team minus Wout Van Aert, and I've forgotten the other member of the Tour de France team, but Dumoulin, Kruijswijk, Roglic, Tony Martin, George Bennett, Robert Hessink. But Yeah, interested to see how Dumoulin, Kruijswijk and Roglic race together. Yes, Sepp Kuss is the other rider, along with Wout Van Aert, who is down in their Tour de France team. It was named last December, although at that time it was Laurens de Plus, and George Bennett has come in for Laurens de Plus. So yeah, an interesting few days in France, Tour de l'Ain, later this week.
La region, famous for its chicken, of course, Bourg-en-Bresse chicken.
Here we go.
Famous incident a couple of years ago when one of my crew, my ITV crew, was very put out, being asked to spend €38, I think, for a breast of chicken. Was that an evening orchestrated by you, Napalm?
Probably. I do enjoy the trip to the chicken restaurant in Bourg-en-Bresse.
It's good, but it is a bit overpriced, isn't it?
I think it was on that occasion. I think we were too big a group, because normally they didn't feel like very generous chicken portions.
No, there were lots of complaints. I felt a lot of pressure that evening because obviously I'd bigged up the chicken. And
I made you feel bad now. I feel terrible. I feel terrible now.
Well, I don't.
For even
don't
bringing
feel
this
terrible.
up.
Don't feel terrible. I didn't feel bad then, and I don't feel bad now because my chicken was both generously sized and delicious.
I mean, it did ruin that Tour de France for you, though. That experience, Lionel, didn't it? You were really grumpy for the rest of the race.
I don't think I was.
I'm assuming that's because of what happened in Bourg-en-Bresse, but it might have been other things. I can't remember. Are we going back there this year? We're going very close to Bourg-en-Bresse this year. Might be able to pull in for a quick chicken. What do you think?
Why not? I mean, maybe this year they'll be serving it in a bucket. €98.
We should wrap things up, not least because I've got to go and do an interview with Leah Thomas for the cycling podcast Femina. A little reminder that our beautiful new cycling jerseys made by Katusha are available. Go to thecyclingpodcast.com shop to order your jersey. We've seen a few of them on social media. Did you open the box in the end, Lionel?
I did indeed, yes. I was relieved to find out that I can fit into one of the jerseys. They're quite a pro racers fit, aren't they?
Just before lunch, though, is that right?
I've seen a lot of appeals, I would say, on social media for pictures of you two in the new jerseys.
Well, as soon as I get mine, I will take a picture of me in it and maybe post it somewhere, depending. No, I will. I promise. I will. I'm looking forward to getting it and riding it on the roads around here, which are fantastic for cycling, by the way. Doing a lot of cycling at the moment. Channeling Wout Van Aert the other night as I was out there on the dirt roads of Picardy. Lots of dirt roads here. It's all the rage. Anyway, should we wrap things up for this week? We want to say some thank yous to friends of the podcast. Very grateful to all of you who've signed up as a friend of the podcast. From me this week, big thanks to Lorna Walker, Peter Godfrey, Peter Lovell, Clifton May, Paul McAlevey and Eric Smith.
And thank you to John Griffith, Hans Forhaug, Richard Tuxworth, Tim Dool, Lars Eric Berg and Tom Fennerty.
And from me to Jeff Adams, John Castaneda, Nancy Quintanilla, Eileen Joyce, Jeremiah Nieves and Dustin Judice.
Thanks, Lionel.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, chaps. Thank you.